I started climate activism simply because I wanted to do something that could cause change in the lives of the people in my community. And I'd clearly seen how many people are affected by climate change in the various rural communities and what really needs to be done to stop the suffering of those people. I've been able to take my activism internationally, and that is how I got invited to the Arctic Base Camp at the World Economic Forum, and that is how I got cropped out of a photo by a media company. And I must say that that experience made me a stronger person. But today, I really don't want to focus on that. I want to focus more on how climate change and peace building relate in the various communities. Climate change is the biggest threat facing humanity right now. It is an issue that involves so much of human security and human survival. And in most cases, only the most privileged survive, while the less privileged are left to suffer the impacts of climate change. Climate change greatly affects the world's social systems, economic systems, and political systems. And it doesn't only have the primary effects that we all know. Those are the floods, the droughts, the heat waves, the storms, the hurricanes, among others. Climate change comes with secondary effects as well that we tend to ignore in many cases. I mean, how can you focus on something that doesn't affect you personally? Most of the people who tend to focus on these challenges are those who are the most affected by the impacts of climate change. We need to do something about these impacts because climate change makes every other crisis and challenge more dangerous for the affected communities. When climate change strikes, many people are forced to migrate to other places to look for better ways of survival. Many people's homes are submerged by floods, by hurricanes in these communities that are prone to climate change. So you find that many of these people are left with nowhere to stay, and they have to try and find new places of survival. As I say, climate change is an issue that involves human survival. Many people are being pushed to the slums, to impoverished areas. Many are, and more will be subjected to human trafficking, which comes in a way of helping these people. Many will be sold out into forced labor because they hope to survive, they hope to find something to eat for their families, only to realize that they have been put into human trafficking where they're going to suffer for the rest of their lives because they are forced to work. There is sexual slavery and many other challenges that come with human trafficking. And with the climate crisis, many people lose their sources of income, sources of food, etc. And when you look at the children, many of them face a risk of child abuse, child labor, because some of them are either helping out their parents to survive in these new places, or some of them are trying to survive on their own. Many children lose their parents during these climate disasters, and they are pushed to the streets. I have personally seen very many children on the streets of Kampala, and many of them come from the same region that has been hit by intense heat waves and dry spells. And on these streets, they have to beg to find something to eat. But they're also exposed to many dangers as children. They're exposed to forced labor. Some of them are exposed to gender-based sexual violence on the streets. That is why I strongly believe that climate change disrupts any kind of peace in a person's life and in a community. Many of these children are subjected to mistreatment so that they can get a plate of food and a glass of water to survive for the day. Because at this moment, it's a matter of life and death. And they are forced to work just to get a pinch on the bread. Many communities heavily depend on natural resources for survival. For example, we all know Lake Chad in Africa. This lake has shrunk to 10th its size in 50 years, and many people depend on the fresh waters of this lake. What is going to happen if the water is limited and it is not enough for everyone? There is going to be a competition for these resources. Many will start to fight for these water sources. So the fact that climate change greatly affects these water sources, there is going to be a struggle in these communities. There are going to be tensions rising up in these communities because many of them would like to have the upper hand on who uses the water and who doesn't. This is definitely going to bring about conflict in these areas, as many people will have to fight to get the water, and many will die in the process. So climate change is most likely going to increase local riots. And trust me, only the stronger communities will be able to survive. And you may think that this is something that it is expected to come in the future. But I personally tell you that there are communities that are experiencing that right now. These riots are accompanied with death, destruction of property, making children orphans, and many other challenges that push these communities into extreme violence and extreme poverty. Many people, when they lose their sources of income, they are pushed to start illegal ways of living. Because at this point, it is a matter of survival. I mean, it doesn't matter whatever they do at this point, as long as they get something to eat, they get a place to live. So many of them start joining illegal ways of making income, of bringing in money, hence increasing high crime rates in these communities. But if you've been following, you understand that all this is birthed by climate change. By this point, I really hope that you are getting the impact of climate change on peace and security in people's lives. I'm trying to say that we cannot have peace building without addressing the issue of climate change. Because even if we build the systems that ensure peace, climate change will break these systems. Climate change will weaken these systems. It will weaken communities. It will weaken states. It will weaken countries. And that is why we need to take action as soon as possible. With extreme weather events in countries that are already experiencing conflict, climate change is most likely going to exacerbate these conflicts, these challenges. Because if people are already at war, what will happen if they now have to struggle for the limited resources in their communities? This will just increase more wars in these communities, more fights in these communities, more riots in these communities. This will take away the peace, and many will be affected, not just by the already existing conflicts, but by the new struggles for resources. In my community, very many people heavily depend on agriculture as a form of survival. They depend on the food that they grow. They depend on their farms. But in the case of an occurrence of a climate disaster, many people's homes are destroyed, but also their farms and crops are destroyed. Many people lose their only source of food, and they're left with nothing. Actually, the entire economy heavily depends on agriculture for survival. So what happens if food production is affected? What happens if food systems are affected? We expect less food. And with less food comes high demand from the people. And with high demand from the people, that means the prices are going to go up. If the prices go up, only those who can afford will be able to buy the food, while the less privileged, especially in the rural communities, will not be able to buy the food. What will happen if someone has no access to food? People will riot, people will strike, people will protest just to get the food prices to go down. And with this comes disruption of peace. With this comes destruction of the systems that have already been built to ensure peace in these communities. Because without food in a community, you do not expect to have peace. You don't expect people to be happy. People will have to complain, because if they don't have food, that means many of them will be subjected to starving to death, and no one wants to die. So they will bring up conflicts and riots in their countries in order to survive. So when it comes to climate change, many lives are at stake. We cannot afford not to take climate action. We cannot afford not to build systems that ensure resilience in these communities. Because with climate resilience, we'll be able to overcome some of these challenges that affect peace in communities as a result of climate change. Because if there is resilience in case of a water scarcity, we won't expect riots, because people will have water to drink.